In the north of Portugal winds a long river that saw the birth of a sweet and dark wine. One of Portugal's world-known symbols, port wine or Porto. For the last 2,000 years, everywhere on the best exposed banks of the Douro, men laid out and hung vines on these steep slopes composed of shale. The Portuguese winemakers learned to survive in this rocky desert universe. With the strength of their arms, they transformed it. The arid hills have given way to extensive vineyards of harmonious curves. Not far from the famous shrine of Lamego extends the Quinta del Bom Retiro, one of the oldest wineries in the country. Small stone walls, terraced vineyards, or ones planted on rocky slopes, this singular territory is an open book in the history of the Douro Valley. Joao De Almeida comes from a long line of producers from the town of Porto. He is the great-grandnephew of Adriano Ramos Pinto, the great architect of this hanging garden. It's the beginning of October. After a capricious summer, some plots are finally ready to be harvested. The final verdict is given by this little device. It measures the sugar content of the grapes.
12 degrees.
12? Well, I guess it won't increase much more. In my case, it's been 40 years of this, and it's never the same. Every year is different. We think we know everything.
You learn something new every time.
You think everything is ruined, and finally, nature blesses us. On the other hand, that's great. We learn that, in fact, we don't understand anything. Nature puts us in our place, especially when we think we're the gods. You see, there's no color, nothing. Let's go.
Have confidence.
Come on, let's go to the harvest.
Despite the cheerful atmosphere that fills the vineyards this season, the grape pickers have not forgotten the Dantesque work of their ancestors and the poor families who came from Spain. They have not forgotten the noise and the echo of crowbars, pickaxes, and later bulldozers, because before planting vineyards, the shell of shale in these hills must be drilled and the rock crushed in order to give the roots a chance to reach the subsoil.
People living here have always worked very hard. It's a crazy job, but it's their region. About my family, we were all from a place where everything was simpler. Coming here from the city to a more difficult area that has awakened in us a spirit of struggle, of conquest.
Today, the use of agricultural machinery greatly facilitates the terracing and planting of new vineyards. But viticulture on the slopes of the Douro remains an ongoing challenge. In winter, as in summer, the weather conditions are extreme. The harvests are made exclusively by hand. But if most of the wine production steps are automated today, the large domains try to preserve certain traditions, like pressing the grapes in large granite tanks called Lagares.
So, how's it going, guys?
Real good, thanks.
Fermentation started?
Yes, it was heating a little less this morning, but now with the crushing, it's getting better.
The grapes been in the tank for how long?
Since yesterday. The day before yesterday, actually.
I didn't think it would be so warm. It has a good color. What you see here is a traditional vinification method, become rare today. We continue to do this for our great wines, our old Portos, which need a lot of color and body. This crushing method, with the feet, is undoubtedly the one that's best at extracting the color and aromas. It gives structure to the wine in a very gentle way.
If the manufacture of port begins on the Douro River, it continues many miles away towards the river's estuary. It must glide westward along the hillsides towards the sea. Suddenly, the mountains flatten, and a city appears. It not only gave its name to Porto, it also gave it all of its energy. Opening directly on the Atlantic Ocean, the second largest city of Portugal was witness to the incredible history of Porto. It's here in 1756 that the Marquis of Pombal defined the first rules of winemaking. He separated the plots according to the climate, soil, and altitude. A century before Bordeaux, he set up the first appellation d'origine. Manuel Cabral is head of the Institute for Port Wines, that controls the quality of all the bottles put on the market. He is inexhaustible on the specifics of this great sweet wine. But for him, as for many historians, the origins of port remain a mystery.
Nobody knows exactly when this process began or why. It's known that eau de vie was added to wine for longer conservation, and in particular, so they'd support long journeys by boat, because much of the Porto wines were exported to England. In the 17th century, when the English stopped getting their wine from Bordeaux, they looked for quality wines they knew elsewhere in Europe, and they then turned to the north of Portugal, within the wine region of Douro.
The first importers of port, the English, have long influenced the wine history of Portugal. A wine merchant was particularly outstanding in the defense of port. Baron James Forrester was even one of the first explorers of the river. He recorded its first topographic and geological surveys in 1848.
The Douro is nearly 550 miles long, 430 in Spain and 120 in Portugal. And on the Portuguese side, there are vineyards almost everywhere. In 2001, when UNESCO classified the vineyards of the Upper Douro as a World Heritage Site, it classified not the river nor the mountains. The river and the mountains are beautiful, of course, but what UNESCO protects today are these landscapes shaped by man. On this map from Baron Forrester, besides the topographical survey of the river and its banks, there are some beautiful details, because the Baron was a good draftsman and a great painter, too. The river's conditions for navigation are very well represented on this small engraving. And here we can see a copy of the Rebelo boat, which was the traditional transport vessel for barrels of wine from the Upper Douro to the cellars of Porto. More exactly, the docks Vila de Gaia, where the wine was then aged in barrels and earned its name before being exported to the world, especially to England.
Baron Forrester died drowning in the turbulent waters of the Douro after capsizing in one of these boats. Navigating the river is a very dangerous journey The flat-bottomed Rebello boats sometimes travel more than 60 miles, overloaded with wine barrels. The boatsmen have to cross the rapids and playing with the currents and using a long oar as a rudder. The goods are destined for the banks of Porto, where the barrels of wine are stored in the cellars of the city, before leaving aboard cargo ships to all corners of the world. To this day, much of the Douro Valley's wine production passes through the city of Porto. Wine barrels are stored in the vast storehouses of Vila Nova de Gaia, Ramos Pinto Ferreira, Sandeman, Taylor, or Cockburn. All the major producers and traders age their wine in these warehouses, recognizable by their long tiled roofs. These buildings were built in 1926 to combat fraud and counterfeiting before export. At the time, the Portuguese government wanted to centralize all the production and especially keep an eye on the vinification methods. Coming from subtle blends of different crops, Porto is a wine whose fermentation is stopped by the addition of an eau de vie. It then ages in barrels and then in bottles. Its ruby color gives way to shades, progressing towards tan, caramel, and orange. The aging of some Porto is counted in decades. It is here where the real treasure of Joao and his family lies hidden.
It already has a beautiful color.
Beautiful.
This is the vintage 1991. I think, however, it needs to be slightly refreshed with a younger wine.
Yes, you're right, sir. This wine's very alive.
For me, this barrel's odor reminds me of my childhood. My father forced me to wash the barrels. Since childhood, when I had bad grades, and I always had bad grades, I spent all my holidays washing barrels. This smell transports me and, in a way, guides my life. After, if you look closely on each barrel, there's a reference that will tell us the whole story of this wine. All this, it reminds us of the harvest, the weather, if it rained or not, if someone broke a leg. In fact, each barrel has a history.
The life of Ramos Pinto is filled with anecdotes and extraordinary journeys related to Porto. On the left bank of the river, a small museum maintains his family's legends, including that of its founder, Adriano. This museum is full of pictures and various objects, each one more unusual than the next. But this story also includes dark times. In the 90s, Joao De Almeida came close to losing some of his vineyards. This painful episode is preserved in the family's archives. These documents and plans tell the story of a battle against the National Electricity Company, or how a winery was literally saved from the waters.
This domain, de Moira, was a success filled with emotion, a real conquest of the Wild West, because there was nothing. It was a desert, and we were able to apply to this operation all of our knowledge. It became exemplary for Portuguese viticulture. When everything had been thought out and reviewed, when everything was almost ready, We were told that a dam would be built and that everything would disappear. My uncle, he had a certain age and problems with his health. He refused to talk about the subject. He immediately collapsed in tears.
The Quinta de Era Moira is well beyond the green hillsides of the upper Douro. In an arid decor a dozen miles from the Spanish border, only one track of earth allows people to reach Quinta. Above the Coa River, almost 500 acres of vineyards that nearly disappeared under the waters of an artificial lake.
I went often on television to talk with these gentlemen from EDP, Electricity of Portugal. They sat on one side, me on the other, during a debate, and at one moment I said, "Only a miracle could save all this, because you do not grasp the importance of the heritage at stake. Only a miracle can save it." 2 weeks later, in the same newscast, the presenter says, "The miracle of the Coa Valley has happened. Archaeologists have discovered carvings dating back to the Paleolithic period." I was in my chair, and I could hardly believe it. I immediately began to pray to the gods of the Paleolithic to thank them.
For the first time in years, Joao visits the site of the former Coa Dam. He's accompanied by Antonio Batista, a famous archaeologist.
Let's go down to the river. There's a small path we created to the bottom of the bank. From there, you'll see the remains of the dam. We can still see the small dam and other buildings. We can see it all quite well.
The Coa Dam was never built. Only one little barrier, built to divert the course of the river, is still visible.
Imagine that at the time when we stopped the dam by government decision, the compensation paid to Portugal Electricity amounted to over 100 million euros. This makes it the highest compensation in the world that was ever paid to save a rock art site. This is one of our glories, and this caused the admiration of the Koreans, Japanese, and all the others.
For several months, the Battle of Coa mobilizes some of the world's most important archaeologists. It must be said that the discovery is extraordinary. It reveals engravings dating from the Paleolithic period, the longest period of our history, that begins 200,000 years ago. This is the period of the hunter-gatherers and the first artists who decorated with large flat stones made of schist. In this rock, flintstone has left eternal drawings for us. Today, protected by UNESCO, the rock carvings of the Coa Valley are visible in their natural environment. For Antonio Batista and the archaeologist Dalila Correia, one of the most beautiful remains is situated on the banks of the river Piscos. Here's the head, very visible, the area of the neck. The back line is beginning to fade because of the roughness of the rock. We clearly see the eye.
The eye is made with a flint. They drew the eye with one single movement.
And here we have the representation of the phallus. There's the glands and a line representing an ejaculation.
This set is absolutely fantastic, and on Portuguese territory, it's the oldest representation of a human.
Of a human, yes.
Who looks like a Cro-Magnon.
A Homo sapien sapien. The now famous representation of the Piscos man is absolutely unique. According to our knowledge of European Paleolithic art, it's a great privilege to be able to contemplate these engravings in this open setting. It's a completely natural place. And the sunlight that we're fortunate to have at this time of day makes this figure very moving. Men with animal heads, entwined horses, aurochs and deer, the rescue of the Coa Valley engravings, and the Erva Moira vineyards only strengthens Joao's will. A few years ago, he embarked on another adventure. A challenge of transforming a shale mountain into a vast domain. Monte Schisto, overlooking the Douro. Joao is trying to apply new production techniques, including a new irrigation system, and also aging his wines closer to the rock.
Hello, everyone. So, there's no drink for me?
Of course, I have one already.
It's there.
Oh, my sweet grandpa.
Oh, my sweet little girl.
Joao is gradually passing his knowledge to his two sons and daughter. Unlike him, who still lives in Porto, they decided to settle here, to, as they say, live in the heart of their vineyards. Just like his father, Mateus continually plants new vines. In the Almeida family, breaking shale spans the generations.
This vineyard will be planted next year. What do you think, Dad?
There's still a lot of stone to break.
There's still much to break. A bulldozer came to dig about 3 to 5 feet deep.
This is already well crushed.
But it must become more like this to make ground for planting, right? Since we were little, we've seen our father plant vines. I was born in 1978, when a very special vine was planted. It lies within the domain of Bom Retiro. This is one of the first vineyards planted vertically in the Douro. My father took me up to the hills, and I watched it all, the machines breaking the stones. I knew it was hard work, but we learn, little by little.
Personally, I have trouble understanding how we got here. My son is the 7th generation to break the shale. I never got used to coming to the mountains to break the stone, day or night, in stifling heat or cold and hard conditions. The best solution would be to go elsewhere for a flatter and easier terrain. But no. I think the reason for all this is that it works like a gold mine. You find a nugget, and then another, and then you're caught in the game. And we can't ever get away from here now.
Both gold diggers and stone breakers, the winemakers of the Douro, are the only ones to know the secrets of harmony that existed for centuries between man and a hostile nature. Every season, to make sure a new Porto comes to life, these men try to preserve a delicate balance, a balance that often depends on a bit of courage, a lot of sacrifice, and sometimes a miracle.